quiet countryside of Harrisville, Rhode Island, a family of 7 arrived in the winter of 1971. They carried with them furniture, memories, and the quiet optimism of a new beginning. Roger and Carolyn Perron believed they had found a peaceful farmhouse to raise their 5 daughters. What they did not know was that something was already waiting inside. The house stood on a parcel of land once owned for generations by the Arnold family. The walls were old, the floors uneven, and the scent of age clung to the air. Yet beneath its charm, history whispered darker things. Local records spoke of deaths, tragedies, and whispers of witchcraft that had soaked into the soil long before the Perrons arrived. From the very first night, the family noticed the cold. Not the winter cold that creeps through wood and glass, but something deeper, an emptiness that lingered in the corners. Doors opened slowly, as if guided by invisible hands. A faint smell of decay floated through the halls, though no source could be found. The children spoke of voices calling their names in the dark. Carolyn began to sense that they were never truly alone. She would rise in the early hours to find the broom missing from its place, or small piles of dirt appearing on the freshly cleaned kitchen floor. At first, she blamed the children, but the children, pale and frightened, swore it wasn't them. As the night stretched on, the disturbances grew bolder. A steady knocking echoed through the house, always just beyond the lantern's reach. Shadows seemed to thicken when no one moved. The air itself felt aware. Neighbors began to avoid the old property. Some said it was cursed. Others said the land had never forgiven what had been buried beneath it. Stories surfaced of a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, who had lived on the land in the 19th century. A name whispered with hatred and fear. She had been accused of witchcraft, of offering her child to the devil, and though never convicted, her name became a wound in local memory. The Perrons did not know these stories yet. To them, the house was only growing colder, the nights longer, and the silence heavier. By the end of their first month, Carolyn began keeping a journal. Her first entry ended with 6 words that would define their next 9 years in that farmhouse. "We think the house hates us." The farmhouse on Round Top Road had stood for more than 2 centuries. It was a relic of colonial New England, when the land was still young and wild. Generations had lived and died within its walls. Farmers' mothers, all tied to the soil that seemed to drink deeply of their sorrow. Before the Perrons, it was known simply as the Arnold Estate. In the town archives, its records stretch back to the 1700s: births, marriages, untimely deaths. Many who had owned it never left, not truly. There were whispers of hangings, drownings, and disappearances, events that faded from history but not from memory. Carolyn had always been drawn to old homes. She loved the way they carried stories, the way the past seemed to breathe through the wood. When she found the farmhouse, she felt its age like a heartbeat. She told Roger it felt alive. Neither of them imagined how true that would become. Their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, brought energy and laughter into the rooms. For a time, felt almost normal. But even in daylight, there was something about the house that refused warmth. The sunlight entered reluctantly. Air was thick with the scent of iron and dust. Neighbors rarely visited. The locals offered polite smiles when the Perrons moved in. Their eyes betrayed something else. One elderly man from down the road said quietly, "Best keep the lights burning after dark." Roger laughed it off. Carolyn didn't. As the days passed, strange coincidences became patterns. Clocks stopped at the same hour, 3:07 a.m. Faint scratching came from inside the walls. When Roger checked it, he found nothing but silence and dust. The dog, a loyal and gentle animal, refused to enter the house after dusk. It would sit on the porch and stare at the door, ears low, growling softly at something unseen. The oldest daughter, Andrea, began to write about her dreams. She described faces in mirrors that didn't belong to anyone in the house. She wrote of feeling watched as she slept, of whispers that called her by name. At first, Carolyn thought it was childish imagination. Then she began hearing the same whispers herself. In the nearby town of Burrillville, the stories about the farmhouse stretched back generations. Some said a woman who once lived there had taken her own life in the barn. Others told of infants found lifeless in their cribs, their mothers driven to madness by voices only they could hear. When Carolyn mentioned the noises to a neighbor, she was met with silence. Then the neighbor said, "It's better if you don't ask about that place." That night, Carolyn woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps moving through the house. Heavy, slow, deliberate. She listened as they crossed the hall and stopped outside her bedroom door. When she opened it, there was nothing there, only the lingering scent of rot, and the quiet sound of something breathing in the dark. The change was slow, almost gentle at first, as if the house wanted them to grow accustomed to its presence before revealing itself. The noises in the night became regular, too patterned to be dismissed as old wood or settling beams. At precisely 3 in the morning, the walls would sigh, the floors would groan, and a faint tapping would begin somewhere deep within the house. Always out of reach, always moving. The Perrons grew used to the creaks and knocks. There were other things that couldn't be explained. Objects shifted positions. A broom leaned against the wall one moment and appeared across the room the next. Photographs fell from their hooks. The air smelled faintly of sulfur in the mornings, fading by midday as if the house itself exhaled. Carolyn began to feel drained. Her body ached without reason. Bruises appeared on her arms, small and circular, as though something had gripped her in the night. She stopped sleeping through the hours between 2 and 4. Those hours, she would later say, felt wrong, as though time itself was thinner than, as though something could pass through it. The children began to hear voices. Whispers that called from the shadows. At first they believed it was one another, until the whispers came even when they were all in the same room. The youngest, April, began to speak to an unseen friend. She told her mother that he lived in the corner by the wardrobe, and that he didn't like when people turned on the lights. Doors opened and closed with soft precision. Footsteps trailed the halls long after the family had gone to bed. Sometimes, faint laughter echoed from the attic. The laughter of someone who wasn't alive. The smell of rotting flesh appeared and disappeared at random. Roger searched the cellar for dead animals but found nothing. He would later describe the basement as a place that felt too still. Even in summer, it was cold enough to see your breath. One evening, Carolyn found the kitchen chairs arranged in a perfect circle. No one in the family claimed to have done it. When she broke the circle by moving a chair, a sudden gust of air swept through the room, blowing out the candles. The house was still for the rest of the night, almost as if it were listening. The next morning, family dog was found dead beside the porch. There were no wounds, no blood, just the faint impression in the snow where it had lain. As though something heavy had knelt beside it before disappearing, the farmhouse began to change in ways that only Carolyn seemed to notice. The wallpaper seemed darker. The ceilings are lower. At night, she heard a voice humming an old tune, soft and sorrowful. Sometimes it came from the walls, sometimes from just behind her shoulder. Local folklore spoke of a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, who had lived near the property in the 1800s. She was said to have been part of the Arnold bloodline, the same family that had built the farmhouse. Neighbors claimed she worshipped the devil, offering sacrifices in exchange for eternal life. A child had once died under her care, and when accused of witchcraft, Bathsheba had allegedly cursed all who would take her land. Historians would later find her grave a few miles away, the headstone cracked and leaning, the letters of her name eroded by time. As winter gave way to spring, the disturbances grew physical. Carolyn felt invisible hands tugging at her hair. Doors slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. One night, a rancid stench filled the girls' bedroom, and their beds began to vibrate, shaking until they screamed. When Roger entered, the smell was gone and the room was still. The entity, whatever it was, began to choose favorites. Carolyn, most of all, felt its attention. She spoke, awaking to the feeling of breath on her neck, of her blankets being yanked away, of a voice whispering her name slowly, lovingly, as though mocking her fear. The girl spoke of a woman with a twisted neck standing by the window. Sometimes she appeared in the corner, watching. Sometimes she stood closer, her eyes reflecting a light that wasn't there. Andrea would later write that the woman's face looked like broken porcelain. The farmhouse seemed to feed on their fear. The more terrified they became, the stronger the activity grew. Furniture moved on its own. The clocks began to stop again at 3:07 every night. Carolyn noticed that this was the same hour when the air turned heavy, when the smell of decay returned. When everything seemed to hold its breath, neighbors began to avoid the road that led past the house. Mailmen left letters at the gate rather than walking up the drive. Some nights, faint lights were seen moving through the fields. Lanterns, it seemed, though no one was there to carry them. Roger tried to repair what he could: broken locks, damaged windows, scratches on the walls that appeared overnight. But he couldn't repair the feeling that something unseen had claimed them. Carolyn started researching the history of the property, visiting libraries and speaking to locals. She found old land deeds, family trees, death notices, all tied to the Arnold family, all connected by tragedy. One pattern kept emerging: mothers dying by their own hand, often after the loss of a child. One woman had hanged herself in the barn. Another had drowned her infant in the creek. Each name, each date, seemed to pull the same thread, a curse that wound its way through generations, binding itself to the soil. By the end of 1972, Carolyn no longer spoke of moving. She knew that whatever haunted them wasn't just in the house. It was in the land itself, in the very bones of the earth beneath them. The girls no longer played outside, the neighbors no longer came near, and at night the farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It felt like a mouth, open, waiting hungry, and from the silence of its walls, something ancient was beginning to wake. By the summer of 1973, the Perron family was reaching its breaking point. Sleep had become a rare mercy, and silence was something they no longer trusted. The house seemed to watch them now, waiting for weakness. Every sound, every creak, felt deliberate. Every shadow seemed to lean closer. It was Andrea, the eldest daughter, who first suggested that what they were facing might not be of this world. Carolyn, desperate and exhausted, began reaching out to local historians and church authorities. Most dismissed her politely. Some refused to speak at all when she mentioned the address, but one contact led her to the name of a man who had been documenting strange phenomena across New England. A man named Ed Warren and his wife, Lorraine, self-described clairvoyant. The Warrens had already earned a reputation in the early 1970s for investigating haunted houses, demonic infestations, and cases the church preferred not to discuss openly. They had visited hundreds of homes, but the Perron farmhouse would leave a mark unlike any other. When they arrived, they found a family hollowed by fear. Lorraine would later describe the house as darkness upon darkness. She claimed she could feel a presence even before crossing the threshold. Something ancient, malicious, intelligent. Ed began documenting the activity with tape recorders and written notes. Lorraine prayed quietly as she walked through each room. She claimed to see the outlines of the dead lingering in doorways. A woman with a rope around her neck, a child crying near the hearth, a man standing silently in the cellar. As the investigation deepened, the Warrens sought historical records of the property and the families who had lived there. What they found was a pattern so consistent it seemed almost deliberate. Town archives showed that the land once belonged to the Arnold family, and that tragedy had haunted their bloodline. Several children had drowned in nearby ponds. A man had hanged himself in the attic. 2 women had taken their own lives after suffering what they described as voices from the ground. And then there was Bathsheba Sherman. Bathsheba's name appeared in an 1800s census record as a distant relative of the Arnolds. Church rumors claimed she was accused of witchcraft after a child in her care died mysteriously, a large sewing needle found embedded in the infant's skull. Though she was never tried formally, the community shunned her. Locals said she worshipped the devil and offered her soul in exchange for power. When she died, no priest would bless her grave. Her headstone, cracked and blackened, lay hidden in the woods. According to local lore, she had cursed the land, vowing that anyone who tried to take it would know only death and despair. The Warrens' cross referenced parish records and discovered an unsettling detail. Several deaths at the farmhouse occurred precisely 120 years apart to the month, each involving a mother and child. Whether coincidence or curse, the pattern could not be ignored. Lorraine reported that the entity haunting the Perrons was not simply a ghost, something darker, a presence that used the guise of the dead to torment the living. It attached itself to Carolyn, draining her energy, isolating her from her family, and whispering thoughts that were not her own. She told it that the thing in the house wanted the family gone, or worse, wanted them dead. Ed began to suspect a diabolical infestation, the earliest stage of possession. But without evidence that could satisfy the church, they had little authority to act, so they turned to what they did best, to documentation. Over several visits, they recorded hours of audio. In the playback, faint voices could be heard beneath the static, some crying, some screaming, some whispering prayers in Latin. The sounds of dragging chains, echo of footsteps when the house was empty. Lorraine kept a small notebook filled with impressions. She described a heavy darkness in the cellar, a feeling of despair near the barn, and the overwhelming presence of a woman who resented the living. She wrote that this woman's energy was cold as stone, angry as fire. During one session, Lorraine felt drawn to a small, sealed opening beneath the stairs. Inside, she found remnants of cloth, bits of bone, and what appeared to be the decayed remains of a handmade doll. Around its neck was a piece of iron wire twisted into a crude symbol. When she touched it, she claimed the air grew thick, and her vision blurred with images of a woman standing in the field, her face obscured by shadow, her hands dripping with blood. Ed took the object and sealed it in a container, fearing it might serve as a conduit for whatever haunted the property. Their notes later described the entity as a manipulative intelligence, not a wandering soul, but something that used human tragedy to anchor itself. It thrived on pain, on grief. The Perrons, with their innocence and vulnerability, were ideal hosts. As the Warrens prepared to involve the church, Carolyn's condition worsened. She became distant, forgetful, her eyes hollow. She complained of sudden chills and of dreams filled with fire. Andrea would later claim that her mother's voice sometimes changed, deeper, slower, unfamiliar. During one visit, Lorraine noted that Carolyn refused to enter the living room. When asked why, she said simply that the lady with the broken neck was there waiting. The Warrens knew that without clerical sanction, they could not perform an exorcism. Instead, they requested a deliverance ritual, a lesser rite intended to drive out malevolent forces without direct confrontation. The ritual was conducted quietly, without church approval, inside the farmhouse one autumn night. They read prayers. They sprinkled holy water. They invoked the name of Christ. And for a brief moment, the air grew still, heavy, silent, almost relieved. Then the temperature dropped. The wind outside began to howl. Every door in the house slammed shut at once. The lights flickered, and a low moan filled the air, rising into a scream that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The Warrens recorded what they could. Power failed before the ritual was complete. Carolyn collapsed. When she regained consciousness, she claimed she had seen Bathsheba, not as a woman, as a thing made of darkness, its face shifting, its mouth whispering in a language no one understood. After that night, the Warrens advised the Perrons to leave the house immediately, but they couldn't afford to. They stayed. And the house, wounded but unbeaten, continued to feed. For years, Ed and Lorraine would revisit the case, bringing new priests, new prayers, and new hope. Each time the house resisted. Each time the darkness remained. Official church records never acknowledged the case. There were no sanctioned exorcisms, no confirmations of possession, only silence, and the unshakable testimony of those who had lived there. In her later writings, Lorraine would call the Perron farmhouse a place of perpetual grief. She believed it was a gateway not between heaven and hell, between the forgotten and the unforgiven. A place where the dead refused to rest. The Warrens eventually withdrew from the investigation, fearing for their own safety. Carolyn's health slowly improved once their visits ceased, as though the entity had grown tired of the attention. But the house never stopped watching. Even after they left, the Perrons would speak of it. The cold spots, the whispers, the faces in the mirrors. No one ever managed to cleanse it completely, and in the archives of the Warrens' collection, labeled only with a date and a location, remains a box of recordings, a rusted nail wrapped in cloth, and a note in Ed Warren's handwriting that reads, "Do not return to Harrisville." When the records were finally assembled, the death certificates, the baptismal notes, old property deeds, a pattern began to reveal itself. Each tragedy that had touched the land followed the same rhythm: a child's death, a mother's grief, and the slow unraveling of reason that ended in blood or rope. It was as if the house demanded tribute, generation after generation. What the Warrens uncovered was not simply a haunting, but a chain, each link forged by despair and anchored by belief. The land, soaked in prayer and sorrow, had become a mirror for those emotions. And when the Perrons arrived, with their innocence, their faith, and their fears, the house reflected it all back upon them, twisted, magnified, alive. Lorraine Warren came to believe that Bathsheba was only the face of something older, a name that had endured in whispers, a vessel for a darkness that predated Christianity itself. Local lore called it a spirit of the earth, an entity that fed on the emotions of the living, growing stronger with every act of grief or guilt performed in its shadow. In one of her private journals, Lorraine wrote that she felt as though the land had been consecrated, then desecrated, that once, long ago, something sacred had stood there, a boundary, a chapel, a place meant to protect. But time, neglect, and tragedy had broken that seal, allowing something else to take root beneath the soil. The theory that emerged was as chilling as it was plausible. The farmhouse was not haunted by the dead. It was using the dead. Their energy, their echoes, their fear. It borrowed their faces, their pain, their voices, to keep itself alive. Bathsheba was a mask. The true presence was older, deeper, patient. This would explain the intelligence behind the phenomena, how it could mimic the living, predict their actions, and strike at their faith. When Carolyn prayed, the house grew colder. When the family argued, it grew stronger. Fear was its language. The church never confirmed the Warrens' findings, but certain documents, hidden in diocesan archives, hinted that Harrisville had once been part of a larger territory under observation by the Catholic order known as the Societas Exorcismi. It was a quiet network of priests and theologians assigned to study sites of recurring spiritual disturbance. One of their 19th century reports described the region as a valley where the boundary between body and spirit wears thin. That report ended abruptly, signed only with a single Latin phrase non tanger terram, do not touch the ground. The Warrens speculated that Bathsheba's act, the sacrifice of her child, whether myth or truth, might have been an offering to this ancient force, binding her soul to it. Her suicide, if it occurred, may not have freed her but trapped her within it, making her both victim and vessel. And so, when new life entered the property, the Perrons, the cycle resumed, a new mother, 5 daughters, and a presence that craved suffering. Carolyn's slow deterioration mirrored those of the women before her. She became frail, sleepless, and increasingly detached from her family. Lorraine believed the entity sought to possess her fully, not for power, to repeat the ritual of despair that had kept it tethered to the land for centuries. The recordings captured during the Warrens' sessions revealed more than sound. Slowed, some of the voices layered upon each other formed coherent phrases. Words in Latin, Old English, and something older still. One voice, faint but distinct, repeated a phrase that Ed translated as, "The mother weeps." It appeared in multiple tapes, in rooms recorded weeks apart. Lorraine interpreted it not as a cry for help, but as mockery, the entity echoing the sorrow of every mother it had destroyed. Over time, the hauntings grew sporadic. After the ritual attempt and the family's decision to remain silent, the activity lessened. It was as though the entity, having fed, no longer needed to reveal itself. It had consumed what it came for: fear, faith, attention. Andrea Perron, years later, would say that the house let them go, but never released them. Each family member carried the memory, the unease, the echo of something unseen that had studied them. The Warrens' case files closed with a single note: infestation unresolved, site unstable, entity non-human. In their lectures, they would speak carefully about Harrisville, never mentioning the address, referring to it as the farmhouse that devoured hope. Lorraine believed the haunting was not bound to a single house, but to the emotion of the land itself, a curse written not in words, but in memory. In the years that followed, others would live there. Some reported nothing unusual. Others claimed the silence itself was the most terrifying thing of all. Visitors described an unnatural heaviness inside, an invisible pressure that lingered long after leaving. Skeptics argued that the Perrons were victims of hysteria, that their minds, starved of rest, created the haunting. But even they could not explain the physical evidence, the bruises, the sudden temperature drops, the recorded voices, or the history of death repeating through centuries. Faith and reason both failed to offer comfort. And perhaps that is the truest horror of the case, that the haunting could not be proven, nor disproven. It simply was. For Ed and Lorraine, the Harrisville farmhouse became a symbol of something they never fully understood. Evil not as a presence, but as a condition. Something that seeps, lingers, and waits for those willing to see it. Lorraine once said, "Some places are born wrong." She never clarified what she meant, but her meaning was clear. The house itself was not cursed, it was the curse. And though the Perrons eventually moved away, the memories followed them. In quiet moments, Carolyn would still hear the low hum of that ancient lullaby. Andrea would still dream of the woman in the corner, face hidden, head bent in sorrow. Even decades later, when the story became legend and Hollywood turned it into a tale of exorcism and heroism, the truth remained darker, quieter, less resolved, because the real story does not end with victory. It ends with a house that still stands, a field that still blooms, and an earth that still remembers every scream that ever touched it. The Perrons left the farmhouse in 1980. 9 years after the first knock, 9 years after the first whisper, they walked away. The land stood unchanged, as if their suffering had meant nothing. The house remained, silent and waiting. No priest ever blessed it. No rite was performed to cleanse it, it simply stayed. Time did what faith could not. It buried the past beneath seasons and dust. Yet, even buried things breathe. Locals still avoid the road at night. Travelers who stop nearby speak of lights moving through the fields, of shadows that cross the windows when the house should be empty. The current owners rarely speak publicly, though they acknowledge that the property has energy. They say the nights are never fully quiet. Sometimes the air grows cold without warning, and the scent of iron seeps from the floors. Andrea Perron would later write that the house was not evil, but alive, a gathering of every memory, every grief, every soul that ever passed through it. She said it spoke in silence, and if one listened closely, it would answer. What happened to the Perrons was not an isolated haunting. It was part of something older, something that belongs not to them, but to the earth itself. A reminder that time does not erase pain, it preserves it. The Warrens never returned to Harrisville. Ed passed away in 2006, Lorraine followed years later. Their notes remained sealed, their tapes untouched, their warnings unheeded. Somewhere in those archives, beneath layers of dust and faith, lies a final report. Unsigned, undated, and incomplete, it ends with a single line: "There are doors that should never have been opened." If you visit Harrisville today, the farmhouse still stands. The trees have grown thicker, the grass wilder, the road quieter. The windows stare back like eyes that have seen too much. And sometimes, when the wind shifts across the field, it carries with it a sound, faint, rhythmic, almost human. It is said that at 3:07 in the morning the house exhales. The walls tremble. The lights flicker, and for a brief moment the air smells of old wood, smoke, and something dying. Then, everything returns to stillness. No screams, no movement, only the silence of a house that remembers. And beneath that silence, the same question that haunted the Warrens remains unanswered. Was it the spirit of Bathsheba? Or something far older? Something that merely borrowed her name? Perhaps it doesn't matter, because some hauntings never end. They only wait for someone new to listen. Some stories end when the sun rises. This one does not. The Perrons left Harrisville, but their silence did not free the land. It sleeps, it waits, it listens. Every creak of old wood, every whisper through forgotten halls may be an echo of what once called that place home. Perhaps evil never truly dies. Perhaps it only forgets its own name until someone speaks it again. If the wind carries a cry at 3:07, if a candle flickers when the room is still, remember the farmhouse on Round Top Road, and the family who learned that not all prayers are answered. Because faith can drive out darkness, but it can also feed it. And somewhere, in a quiet house in Rhode Island, the darkness still remembers theirs.